Hello chess enthusiasts, we have reached the end of the Soviet 1 dozen chess problems, and as you can see number 12 is in front of us, and this, like the previous one, number 11, is white to play and win. White has a slight advantage in material. He has a rook against a knight and 2 pawns against 3 pawns. What I noticed on this one is that, and I've made this point in previous videos, I like to take a file as quickly as I can that may prove useful. In this particular case, it hits you that the B file is quite useful. The king at the moment can move to B7, whereas if you played rook B8, the king would not be able to move anywhere. The only problem is with that sort of a move, or indeed if you move the rook anywhere, is that it permits black's knight to come into the game, and we'd like to restrict this for as long as we can. There are a few variations here that are worth looking at, and even what I consider to be the key move, it does nonetheless not stop black from bringing his knight into the game. But I think you have to reckon with it being brought into the game, but it's how you allow it to be brought into the game that counts. And if you look here, you can see that E6 is certainly the square where it would like to make for, at the moment, hitting the rook. The rook, of course, can't come here to control this file because the knight is covering E8 as well. So really, with all of that in mind, we need to find something just that little bit original. It may well be an idea to stop the black king escaping. Here we just move over to the pocket chess set again. Stop him from escaping via B7. But aside from playing rook B8, which I've just commented on, I'm not really that keen on it, funnily enough. You can't really stop him getting to B7 just for the moment, and even to C6. But I think what we need to consider here is just opening up the pawn position in the C line and the D line. We don't need to worry too much about down here or even here at the moment. Like I say, we can't really stop this knight from entering into proceedings. There's nothing we can do about it. So just take a look at that and have a think at how you'd play your first move. Well, I noticed this move, as I have noticed quite a few of the key moves, pretty quickly, because I want to arrive at a situation where that rook can get into play, whereas at the moment it is being restricted. Even if it were to move to, say, here, you do run into this sort of situation, and then the knight can come here and start causing problems for white. Indeed, if black could manage to chase this king away and capture this pawn, it would perhaps not exactly be a winning position, but it would cause white some concern. So we want to try and stop this knight if we possibly can, although it doesn't seem that easy to be able to do so. So with all of that in mind, what would you say is a key move that would sort of take black's mind perhaps away from what I've just said, messing around perhaps with the knight? It doesn't, as a matter of fact. That is one of the moves that can be played. Funnily enough. Well, you've had a look at it. If you wish to pause the video, I'll just give you a few more seconds. Okay, well, what I had in mind is to play C5. Now, this is a pawn sacrifice. What would you say we're trying to do here? And I think there were 4 possible useful replies to C5. I'll leave capturing the pawn as the final of the variations, because I think that could well be the main line in all of this. Well, I did mention that black could play knight e6. Well, why don't we play knight e6 and see what happens? Okay, so what must be noted here is that black is not only attacking the pawn here that has just been pushed, but he's also simultaneously attacking the rook. So does that mean that c5 is a blunder? I mean, surely we don't want him to take the rook, do we? What would you say? Shall we let him take the rook? Or shall we move it? Well, if we move it, he's just going to take this and give check. So we've given a pawn away and we've not interrupted his pawn structure at all. And then he'd have two connected pass pawns, wouldn't he? And a knight that's very usefully placed to boot. So we can't really allow him to take that pawn. Any ideas what white should do here? So it wouldn't really be a wise move to move here, thinking that when the knight moves you can take this, because he'd just take this and he'd fork the king and rook. So that wouldn't be a good idea. Well, you can let black take the rook here, but not that way. White's second move in question, you've sacrificed a pawn and you didn't accept it. Now what about sacrificing the rook? Incidentally, now he can't really take the pawn because you'd take back check and you'd win the knight. So taking the pawn is not an option. And he could check the king, yes, but you could move it to here and then you'd be attacking the knight. This pawn is hanging here. It's looking a bit dangerous, isn't it? So I don't really think he'd want to do that. Most chess players, they would say, I'm going to take that rook. And you see, if he were to push this pawn something like this, well, there'd be nothing really to stop you sort of playing something like this. And he has to move the knight, say, to here. And then you have to watch out for the knight forks and all that. So just move to here. You're protecting this. Yeah, I know that he can come here. Sure he can. But of course, you can always go here. And he can't keep that knight there. Or you can take this pawn, yeah, and then you queen that pawn. And if he doesn't take that pawn, you can always do this. If he moves it, you queen the pawn, or you take it if he moves the knight there. If he doesn't, you take the knight and then you queen the pawn. So really all of that is of absolutely no use to black at all. So let's just put this back in the starting position again. This is a very interesting final position. I was very pleased to see the layout on this because it's not quite what I expected. I didn't look at any of these positions before I started to solve them that much. Just a brief look at one or two, but I think it spoils the broth of you. You start looking at it and then start turning it over in your mind before you really want to sit down and start to look at it. So that is the starting position. And we played here. He's played what really does look like a troublesome move, admittedly, and then you take the knight. Take the pawn. Beg your pardon. Take the pawn. So that's c5, 96, cd. Now, we're going to take the rook, but just in case he has ideas like this, king b7, what's the answer to that? The king is here, by the way. And he's just played king b7 after c5, 96, cd, king b7. Well, you go here, attacking the knight. The knight comes around here to c5, checking the king. Pretty obvious move. And the king goes to b5. You take the pawn. You play rook e7. The king can only now go to the back rank. If it interposes the knight, it loses it. So you play there, and the white king goes here. If the knight should go to b7 in this position, the idea being that when white checks here, it can interpose. You can play a6, and that gets rid of it, and then he's in real trouble. So the only acceptable move here, and incidentally white is threatening this as well, and he's threatening mate on the move. So the only move to really stop rook e8 is king d8. And then you take the pawn, like I was just saying. King d6, and that's a winning position because this one's going to go as well. And you might be able to hang on to this, but even if you didn't, if you had to exchange it for the knight, you'd have a king and rook against a king. So that is ostensibly a winning position for white. So we'll pop that back to the original position just for a moment. It's particularly good how the white king is able to infiltrate the black position the way that it's doing. And there's a white pawn on c4, of course. Okay, so white plays c5, knight e6. And you take there. So we've just looked at, before we take the rook, we've just looked at king b7, and I think we've established that that doesn't work. What happens if, instead of taking the rook, black just takes the pawn? Well, I think I might have already been over this one. Checks the king and picks up the knight. Yeah. So that's okay. Right. Right, so after c5, knight e6, you take the pawn on d6. So take the rook. What do you do there? What move can white play on his third move that would compel black to resign? It's pretty clear cut, isn't it? You just take the pawn. Now, there are two threats here. Firstly, to take the knight, or queen the pawn. If the king comes here, you just take the knight. And if the knight moves, say to here, or to here, check with our new queen. So that is a very sound sacrifice, and that shows that c5 would appear to be the correct line of play, because you can deal with the knight comprehensively that way. However, there are one or two other variations. which we'll look at. So that's the original position again. Okay, so after c5, I think we've established that knight e6 doesn't work on this one. So c5 really eliminates that nuisance knight move. So what happens after d5? We're not taking the pawn yet. We'll leave this until last to show you what I think is the main line. Maybe the compilers of this particular problem felt that knight e6 is the main line because it looks so troublesome, but it's not. And that is a really forcing way for white to win. There's no defense against it. But anyway, we'll look on knight e6 as our first choice. We'll look on d5 now. So what happens here? What would you say is a good move? Well, in fact, it's this c6, and it cuts the b7 square off. You're not cutting it off with a rook, you're cutting it off with a pawn. And so, really, black only has one move, because he can see either this or this coming. So here we have knight e6 again. It's protecting that. But then we take this pawn. So what's happened here is we have gone from having a rook and two pawns against a knight and three pawns to a rook and two pawns against a knight and two pawns. And black's king cannot move. And to check here, the rook would just take the knight. So the knight has to be a little bit inventive and probably chase the rook around a bit. Knight f4. And I think in that position, quite probably, you would want to go after this pawn, because as soon as you get rid of this, you can queen this. So the idea would be to restrict the knight from coming anywhere near to this pawn, and or protecting this pawn, and also checking and forking the king and rook. So you would have to be a little bit careful. Clearly, if you go here, he goes back here. So you have to stop him from coming down this way. And probably the best move here would be this, I would think, because that would stop him either going here or going there. And then with a bit of luck, you can manage to find your way around. If he comes this way, for instance, then you can go down here. Just to identify it, you can go like that. You still have to watch out for the checks, but I think you'd be able to pick that up. And of course, if you went over here attacking the rook, then you would still be looking. Probably can't go here to hit the pawn. You'd have to be careful, but I think that stops the knight from coming down here at all. So the next move, of course, would be to go here and pick up. The king can't move. So where does the knight go from there? It's really stuck like such as that, and then really you could come either here or here and pick up the pawn, and that will be a one game. So really d5 is no use. So I think we can eliminate that one. It's necessary in open play like that, I find, to restrict the movement of the knight. If you can stop it, if you can see what it wants to do, cut it off. So that's the original position again. We played c5, we've tried knight e6, we've tried d5. And we've tried king b7, haven't we? I did mention that in a previous Just have a c5, yeah. And what happens with king b7? I'm pretty sure that I've mentioned this. Well, we'll go through it again. You take here, and he plays here. If he were to play takes, then you play rook d7 and you're getting the knight on the 7th, so that's not an option. So knight e6. And again, you can play this move, even with the king there, because if the knight should touch the rook, then you just take the knight and queen the pawn. So in this position, you've a choice, black. It can either take with the king or with the knight, but it can't afford to touch the rook. So let's just say it takes with the king. So probably the best move in this position would be to play here. And again, it's cutting the knight off from these squares. The main aim there would be to go after this pawn and try and keep a hold of this one. But if in the end you could manage to just have the king and rook against the king, that is quite clearly a winning variation. So that would also be a win for white. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Let's put the position back again a moment. Right, that's back in the original position, yeah. Right, just bear with me a moment. Just take a look at c5, and we've tried knight e6, it doesn't work. We've tried d5, it doesn't work, and king b7 doesn't work. So what we're going to have a look at now is where black accepts the pawn sacrifices, albeit at creating double pawns on the c line. Just take a look at that for a moment. There's another line here, just before we move on to taking the pawn. If he did play here, then, like I did say before, there's this move. And he plays knight e6. Then take the pawn here, yeah. And if he plays king d7, there is rook h8 as well. That is worth thinking about. Should he play here, then you can always go to b5. And what you have there, of course, is you have opportunities of taking the 7th. That's probably an improve. That's what I was trying to think of before, because I felt that I'd been through this, and I can see now that I have. And that is probably a superior line, because what he's running into is not really being able to defend that pawn without going onto the back rank, because if he were to come here, then it just goes. Then so really, if he goes onto the back rank, even like this, he's hemmed, and then he'd have real problems. So I think that rook h8 would be the answer there to king b7. as the immediate reply. So we'll just go back and then we'll capture the pawn as the final variation in this. I think what's been shown already is that white's choice of c5 is correct. So it just remains for this final line to be proven to be also good enough. So just have the correct position there. Yes. Okay, so c5. Black decides to take it. What do we do now? Well, I did mention the 7th rank just a moment ago. So why don't we? Rook d7. And of course, he's bound to play knight e6. Note, with taking this pawn, he doesn't have the opportunity with his knight of checking on the square. He's won a pawn, but at the expense of being able to perhaps utilize his knight the way that he would want to. And you play rook e7, hitting the knight. Where does it go? Well, you can go to d4, I suppose. You take this pawn. And how does black play here? Can't move the king. Can he defend this pawn? Not by here, the king would take it. Certainly not by going here. Go here, you take the knight. So the only move that he has is knight e6. The problem with that is we come into this situation again where you win the knight by placing the rook between the king and the knight. The only move that he'd have, of course, would be to here. So you take the knight, and quite clearly that is a one game. The king can't come forward. You're going to win this pawn. You're going to finish him, whether you win this or not. It's as simple as that. You'll get a back rank mate. There's no doubt about that. So I think what that demonstrates is that c5 is indeed the correct move. And I was very pleased to find that. So that wraps up the 12 problems. This was the second of white to play and win, and I think that's a good way to finish. Very interesting problem, and they have been thoroughly enjoyed by me, and I hope by you. And I've had these problems for a very long time and not had the time to look at them, and I found myself with some spare time, so I've devoted it to doing all of this and improving my chess skills at the same time. And I did promise in an earlier video that one of these days I'd go through this whole magazine with you. Well, it's 32 pages from cover to cover, and we've, as you'll agree, just switching over to it for a moment, there are 2 pages worth here. But the article on Karpov I think is very interesting, and I'll go into this in greater detail at some future point. As you can see, Anatoly is there at a pretty young age, and it's well worth reading. And that game that he played against Boris Spassky is also interesting. But there are articles on Alekhine and Capablanca. The Capablanca one is quite interesting. Like it mentions in this magazine, he did visit the Soviet Union, as it was at that time, 3 times, and he was highly successful at Moscow 1936. So we'll have a look into that in greater detail one of these days. And I also mentioned Richard Ruti's book, New Ideas in Chess, the German edition from 1922. So we can also have a little look at that. And very interesting player, and died at no age through scarlet fever in 1929. So he's been gone a very long time, and most unfortunate. A lot of great chess players died at not much of an age. Breyer, Karuzek, and Dr. Perlis. He was frozen to death on a mountain in 1913, believe it or not. Some death, isn't it? He competed at the St. Petersburg 1909 tournament. He wasn't scheduled to play in that tournament, but he happened to be in town, as the organizer put it, and one of the competitors had to drop out, so they brought Dr. Perlis in, and he wasn't very old, only in his 30s when he died. So, and Paul Morphy, of course, 47, is not ancient by any means. Carl Schlechter, 44, and Harry Nelson Pillsbury, it's still 33. Some of the greatest chess players of all time who didn't really reach their zenith, but they've left a lot of wonderful games, testimony to their greatness, and if they were alive today, I'm sure they would acquit themselves very well indeed. And good luck to you all in your chess endeavours, and I hope that your play has improved. What I would say in summing up in all of this is that my desire really in presenting these for you and me is that if we ever encounter these sorts of positions in practical play, you'll think to yourself, yeah, I remember that sort of a line, that diagonal situation, or that on the rank or on the file, or discovered attack, or that business of blocking the link on the ranks and cutting it out and then delivering checkmate because you've cut out the link in the opposing pieces. It's all very worthwhile to note all of these things, because it builds a pattern in your mind, and then you can call on that pattern when needed, and it can save you a lot of time on the clock. I'm not a very good player with the clock. I didn't learn my chess in the conventional way over the board. I had to do it by correspondence, and so when I eventually started playing over the board, I was in a lot of difficulties with it. To suffice to say, I should have won games if I'd been able to handle the clock better. I played in a tournament in the 1980s in the Channel Islands, and it was a 9-round Swiss, and I ended the event with 4.5 points out of 9. I had 2 wins, 5 draws, and 2 losses. Now the 2 losses were both winning positions for me, and I lost on time. The flag fell in each of those cases on the clock. And fair dues, you do have to handle the clock. I fully accept that, and you need to be able to find a way of doing it. I don't know whether I'll be able to handle it any better. I haven't played competitive chess in a long time, but I feel that I'm not a clock person, and either you are or you aren't. So I wouldn't trust myself in speed chess. I enjoy watching it, but I don't think I'd be able to handle that very well at all. But what was interesting in that particular tournament is 2 achievements for me. I drew against the future Grandmaster Neil MacDonald, and I also captured the under-25 Channel Islands Champions title. So it wasn't a total loss, but it is a bit peeving when you lose on time, and I know what it feels like, and my commiserations to anyone who's found themselves in that position. We really must handle the clock. It is a problem, and 40 moves in 2.5 hours or whatever. This is why it's essential, I suppose, to learn opening theory as well as you can, and then you can whisk through the first, say, 15 moves, and then if you know middle game theory fairly well, that's good. But you need to have a good grasp of endgame theory, and that is a point that Capablanca made, and I wholeheartedly agree with him. You do need to have a good grip of the endgame. So, fellow chess players, all the very best, and I might speak to you again in the future. Until then, enjoy yourselves, and bye-bye for now.